2022 is a standout year for biodiversity, for science and policy, and especially for IPBES. Not only is this the first time that IPBES member states will meet in person since the start of the global pandemic, and considered 2 vital new IPBES assessment reports, but it also marks the 10th anniversary of IPBES itself. In April 2012, nearly 100 countries gathered in Panama City to recognize the vital need for credible science to better inform decisions about nature. Together, they established an intergovernmental platform to strengthen the links between science and policy, and IPBES was born. Although there were many parallels with the work of the IPCC on climate science, it was clear even from those earliest days that IPBES was different. It brought together experts under a conceptual framework emphasizing the importance of different knowledge systems and the value of a wide selection of voices. From the natural and social sciences to indigenous and local knowledge, as well as the expertise of practitioners from every region of the world. Looking back a decade later, we salute the incredible contributions of the thousands of experts who have given their time and knowledge so freely. The tens of thousands of reviewers who have helped to improve IPBES's work, the innumerable stakeholders who continue to expand IPBES's impact, and the member states whose support and collaboration make the work of IPBES possible. There have already been 8 sessions of the IPBES plenary and 8 landmark assessment reports on pollination, scenarios and models, land degradation and restoration, and 4 regional assessments as well as the global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. There have also been 2 IPBES workshop reports, dozens of capacity building activities, work on scenarios and models and on policy support tools, and significant advances on knowledge and data. IPBES's work on communications and stakeholder engagement has also successfully raised the profile of the biodiversity crisis and what can be done about it to unprecedented levels of global awareness and priority. IPBES too has seen a decade of growth. From less than 100 original member states, the IPBES membership has now grown to 139. With a goal of universal membership, IPBES continues to tackle the challenges that transcend all borders and threaten the well-being of all people. It has been a decade of real impact. Key messages and policy options from IPBES reports have been taken up at the highest levels of international governance, with decisions at the Convention on Biological Diversity and other biodiversity-related conventions, actions by the G7 and the G20, policy changes by parliament and legislatures, new nature-positive approaches to private sector investments, and even some very personal individual commitments and actions for nature. In addition, it has also been a decade of achievement. IPBES has received a number of accolades in recognition of its work, from the Win-Win Gothenburg Sustainability Award to the Prince Albert II of Monaco Award. It has even been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for each of the last 3 years. So what's next for IPBES? 2 new landmark IPBES reports will be considered by IPBES member states and are planned for launch at IPBES 9. One on the sustainable use of wild species and the other on the diverse values of biodiversity. A third, on invasive alien species and their control, is due to be launched in 2023. Work has also begun on the IPBES assessment of transformative change and of the nexus between biodiversity, water, food, and health. Finally, on the near horizon is an assessment of the links between business and biodiversity. Thank you for being part of the IPBES journey. With your support, the next decade is shaping up to be even more important, and we look forward to sharing that with you, working together on science and policy for people and nature.
A very good morning, everyone. God morgen alle sammen. Mitt navn Jan Petter Hubert Hansen. Jeg jobber i Miljødirektoratet her i Trondheim, og jeg har fått oppgaven med å guide oss gjennom dette fagseminaret. Vi har et veldig innholdsrikt og spennende og temmelig tett program som ligger foran oss. Og før vi går i gang så tenkte vi hadde en liten oppmuntring for å komme i stemning. Så ta godt imot Pirum.
Tumma, mumla og brumma, kling, klang, drikklanga og uttår. Blant hjeltar av Bakkus med sin mann. Blant hjeltar av Bakkus med sin mann. Tjo, hei! Korus i koret, sukkar, gråter, nyseda spelar, munninga låter. Kling, klang, drikk granne hva du kan.
Ukekoret Pirum fra Studentersamfunnet i Trondheim. Og vi da svært fornøyd med at vi har blitt invitert til å synge her, fordi det her passer jo som perfekt for oss. Bærekraftig bruk av ville arter. Vi representerer jo sånn sett en slags vill art, og tror det eller, men dessverre så er vi også i fare av å gå, altså vi er utrydningstrua da, rett og slett. Så det finnes da faktisk bare 20 spesier av denne arten i hele verden. Tenk litt på det, og selv om det har holdt seg ganske stabilt i mange år, så er det altså da lite som skal til før det eventuelt bare forsvinner. Og hvis du lukter på sokkene våre, så skjønner du kanskje hvorfor. For det er jo da ikke liksom, kanskje den beste lukta. Men vi vet jo kanskje alle at hva som skal bedømme hvilke arter som bør holdes i live, burde ikke være lukt på sokker eller utseende. Alle arter er jo da viktige på sin måte i økosystemet, og hvem vet hva som ville ha skjedd med verden om artene her hadde dødd ut? Det håper jeg at vi aldri får finne av. Og det er da blant annet takket være dere. Av den grunn så tenkte vi da å synge en av våre største bangere, så derfor syng Pirum Jodel im Trollstigen.
Skal jeg holde den?
Vårt hjem er mobil. Heidi-lille-lille-lille-lumpo. Leder oss en mobilbarn og boksøl, vi kommer sivilt. Heidi-lille-lille-lumpo. Med mobilbarn og boksøl foran huset sauer og bak en jaguar. Utsikten er vakker, folk tuter på far. Han hører ikke lett når vi oppdager spil. Heidi-lille-lille-lumpo. Bom, bom, bom. Her er det faktisk bussholdeplass, enda et sted å tømme vår dass. Ein, svei, drei og lommoseil, her finnes seg Erik og Klein. Helga Heinz er nicht idiot, bilen er praktisk godt. Henger vi har om en flaks, fylles den opp med laksraps. Utenfor bilvindu i midnattssol. Heidi-lille-lille-lille-lom-bom-bom-bom. Lederhosen svinger seg, Fräulein så varm og fiol. Heidi-lille-lille-lille-lom-bom. Med dansenummer springer til.
gerade in Galloping mit Bubel gefahren, nein?
Mit Heinz, bitte. Heinz. Heinz.
Oh, egal. Ich liebe dich. Das Kind.
Ich habe Sauerkraut in meiner Lederhose.
Oh, du Scheißkind! Alles gut.
Ein Schweißer Miller, die Lamme med rumpa-figur. Snabbekesse, hei-dilli-lei-dilli-lompo. En klarstigen kommer som en hilsen ifra vår kulturbratwurst. Hei-dilli-lei-dilli-lei-dilli-lei-dilli, hei-dilli-lilli-lilli-lom-bom-bom-bom.
Der var den. Ja, tusen takk til Pirum. Det greit å ha litt å gå på når vi skal snakke om et veldig alvorlig tema utover dagen. Dette fagseminaret det bevisst lagt hit til NTNU, ikke minst med tanke på for å nå ut til dagens unge studenter. For det dere som må rydde opp etter oss. Vi har stilt oss i en ganske dårlig posisjon, så da skal vi hjelpe dere litt på vei, men det dere som må ta jobben senere. Og da, i den sammenheng, så gir jeg da, eller i forlengelsen av det, så gir jeg da ordet til Øyvind Weiby Gregersen, som dekan her ved Fakultetet for naturvitenskap på NTNU. Vær så god.
Tusen takk for det, og velkommen hit. Det en glede å se så mange her, og så mange som interessert i dette viktige temaet. NTNU veldig opptatt av biodiversitet og tap av biodiversitet. Det sammen med klimaendringer på en måte det jeg ser på som de to hovedutfordringene, og som vi må jobbe med i utdanning, i forskning og i formidling. Neste sliden her, den kjenner nok mange av dere veldig godt. Jeg har tatt den med her fordi dette en slide jeg bruker. Senest så brukte jeg den på en strategisamling med ledergruppa og styret til Fakultet for naturvitenskap, som et av bakgrunnsbildene på hva vi har å jobbe med. Og dere kjenner nok dette igjen, altså det viser hvordan ulike typer økosystem og arter trua. Dette fra Summary for Policymakers of the Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Det mitt nivå, policymaker-nivå. Men det vi også ser at for landarter og ferskvannsarter så det menneskenes bruk av areal som den største driveren. Nummer 2 det dere skal snakke om i dag, nemlig direkte bruk eller høsting av artene. Mens for marine arter så det høsting som den største driveren for tap av biodiversitet. Det kjenner dere nok godt, men poenget her egentlig at dette viktig også for ikke-biologer. Det viktig for alle, og noe vi bruker på NTNU. Hva gjør vi så på NTNU? Ja, vi jobber jo med forskning og utdanning. Vi bygger om utdanningene våre, sånn at alle studenter skal lære om bærekraft og sette sitt fag i sammenheng med bærekraft. Og så jobber vi forskningsmessig. En av viktige grepene siste år åpningen av Gjærevoll-senteret, som også partner i dette arrangementet her. Her står rektor og åpner Gjærevoll-senteret, og dette jo et senter som skal jobbe med fremtidsanalyser av biodiversitet, kunne forutse hvordan menneskenes oppførsel, hva vi gjør og ikke gjør, påvirker biodiversitet fremover, og på den måten gi oss et bedre beslutningsgrunnlag for hvordan vi skal klare å innrette oss, sånn at menneskene kan leve, samtidig som vi ikke ødelegger verden rundt oss. Bærekraft har vært på NTNUs agenda lenge. Det et av de strategiske satsingsområdene våre, og innenfor satsingsområdet sustainability, så nettopp biodiversitet en av de 4 hovedarbeidsområdene. Men vi jobber også med andre ting. For eksempel AD-fakultetet, arkitektur og design, har veldig godt arbeid, god forskning innen det de kaller smart sustainable cities. Altså hvordan skal vi ha vårt bygdemiljø på en måte som gjør at vi både godt for mennesker å bo i, men også kan fungere på et vis som ikke for ødeleggende for resten av den verden vi avhengig av. Så har vi her ved Fakultet for naturvitenskap hatt og har fremdeles Senter for fremragende forskning, Center for Biodiversity Dynamics, som har tatt fram en del av det faglige grunnlaget for Gjærevoll-senteret, her man nettopp har jobbet med artsdynamikk. Skal vi se. Altså, det var vel egentlig min hovedinnledning. Poenget dagens tema viktig for NTNU, og jeg setter stor pris på at vi kan ha dette seminaret her. Og jeg ønsker oss alle så mye lykke til som overhodet mulig med dette viktige arbeidet fremover. Takk.
Tusen takk for det, Gregersen. Det slik at denne rapporten som vi skal presentere her i dag, den berører veldig essensielle og mange viktige oppgaver også i Miljødirektoratet. Og det også Miljødirektoratet som nasjonalt kontaktpunkt og koordinator for Naturpanel i Norge. Og da skal jeg gjerne gi ordet til Aina Holst, som seksjonsleder for trua arter og naturtyper. Og hun skal da fortelle litt nærmere om sammenhengen mellom Naturpanelet og Miljødirektoratet. Vær så god.
Takk for introduksjonen, Jan Petter. Og takk for fine ord, Øyvind. Og takk for at vi fikk komme hit til NTNU og ha det her fellesseminaret. Vi har sett frem til det. Særlig godt å se alle dere som sitter i salen her. Som nasjonalt kontaktpunkt for Naturpanelet det en glede for Miljødirektoratet å ønske velkommen til dagens fagseminar. Hovedformålet med seminaret å formidle hovedfunnene og det faglige innholdet i en av Naturpanelet sine nyeste rapporter, nemlig den tematiske rapporten om bærekraftig bruk av ville arter, som ble ferdigstilt nå i sommer. Da Naturpanelet kom med sin første globale hovedrapport i 2019, slo det fast at det her med uttak eller høsting av ville arter den viktigste globale årsaken til tap av naturmangfold i havet. Og den nest viktigste årsaken til tap av naturmangfold på land og i ferskvann. Dette bildet kan være noe nyansert når vi kommer ned på de ulike nasjonale nivåene. Men det viktig å få mer kunnskap om hva som kan bidra til en mer bærekraftig bruk av ville arter, for å kunne være i forkant i forvaltningen. I Norge det blant annet naturmangfoldloven og havressursloven som regulerer forvaltningen av naturmangfold til havs, til lands og i ferskvann. I begge disse lovene legges det vekt på at høsting skal være bærekraftig, og ta hensyn til naturmangfoldet og deres leveområder, det står det i havressursloven, og at høsting ikke skal true overlevelsen av den aktuelle bestanden i naturmangfoldloven. Jeg har tatt med ett eksempel fra forvaltningen. Hjorteviltbestandene i Norge har utviklet seg til å bli en naturressurs av stor samfunnsøkonomisk betydning, blant annet på grunn av en bevisst og målrettet forvaltning. Hjortevilt betyr mye for lokal verdiskaping og påvirker også andre samfunnsområder på en negativ måte. Jeg har sett frem til dette seminaret, vært med i planleggingen av det. Artig at vi har fått til et sånt bredt sammensatt program for dagen. I kjernen står altså formidlingen av funnene i rapporten. Og til det har vi fått 3 av Naturpanelets forfattere, som skal overta her om et øyeblikk. Så håper jeg at alle sammen får en lærerik dag. Tusen takk til NTNU, til Norsk institutt for naturforskning og til Gjærevoll-senteret, som arrangerer dette møtet sammen med oss. Ser frem til dagen. Vær så god.
Tusen takk for det, Einar. Som dere så på filmen, så fikk dere kanskje med dere at Naturpanelet er ca. 10 år gammelt. Og en som har vært med i Naturpanelet og arbeidet der hele tiden, det er vår fagdirektør fra Miljødirektoratet, Nina Vik. Og hun er da både nasjonalt kontaktpunkt for Naturpanelet og også nasjonalt koordinator for det som blir gjort på Naturpanelet i Norge. Så da, Nina, gir jeg deg ordet, så tar du oss videre gjennom hva Naturpanelet er.
Tusen hjertelig takk, Jan Petter. Skal vi se. Tusen hjertelig takk, og jeg må si at jeg også synes det er supert med dette vi har fått til i dag, så jeg gleder meg til fortsettelsen. Når vi har hatt sånne type seminar før, når Naturpanelet kommer med nye rapporter, og da tar vi som regel med en liten introduksjon om Naturpanelet, for vi tror jo at alle kjenner Naturpanelet, men det gjør de ikke, så det er viktig med å spread the gospel litt mer. Den første videoen dere så, da fikk dere et lite innblikk i hva Naturpanelet gjør, så jeg kommer til å fortelle litt mer om det også der. Hva er Naturpanelet? Er det et ord som dere ofte kommer til å se på engelsk, så er det dette med Science Policy Platform. For jeg tror veldig mange kjenner til det med at Naturpanelet leverer rapporter, som den vi skal høre om i dag, men det er faktisk også veldig viktig denne møteplassen da mellom vitenskap og policymakers, beslutningstakere. Panelet ble jo opprettet i 2012 i Panama City, og er bygget opp ganske likt som klimapanelet, IPCC. Og Naturpanelet var veldig etterlengtet. Det var mange land som jobbet for å få dette på plass. Og en av grunnene er det at man så det hvor viktig klimapanelet var for arbeidet med klimaendringene, og det å få solid kunnskap som beslutningstakere kunne jobbe med. Og det samme var helt klart behov for innenfor dette med biologisk mangfold, økosystemtjenester og så videre. Så det var et veldig etterlengtet panel. Og Naturpanelets eksperter produserer jo da veldig solide, uavhengige rapporter, som den vi skal bli kjent med i dag. Men som jeg sa, IPBES, altså Naturpanelet, er da også den koblingen mellom brukere og forskere. For det er nemlig brukerne, altså både land, globale miljøavtaler og andre, det er de som bestemmer tema for rapportene. Det er det ikke ekspertene som gjør. For det her er jo hele poenget at disse rapportene skal være relevante for ulike samfunnsproblemer. Så det er brukerne som bestemmer temaene, men så jobber man sammen da om å definere hva rapporten skal inneholde, og så får forskerne jobbe i fred med selve rapportene. Men en ting hadde jeg lyst til å si, for både for klimapanelet og naturpanelet så hører man liksom mest om disse store rapportene som kommer. Men Naturpanelet har faktisk 4 like viktige funksjoner. En ting å lage kunnskapsanalysene, altså disse rapportene. Den annen ting dette med kapasitetsbygging, capacity building, og der har faktisk Norge vertskap for en såkalt teknisk støtteenhet på kapasitetsbygging, som ligger her i Trondheim. En annen funksjon dette med å, altså når rapportene, de identifiserer jo mange kunnskapshull, det sier seg selv. Og Naturpanelet ikke en forskningsinstitusjon, altså de driver ikke egen forskning, men de bidrar, altså de liksom en katalysator for det med å dekke kunnskapshull. Blant annet da ved å involvere nasjonale forskningsråd og lignende. Så det med å være en katalysator, og så har de den 4. funksjonen det at en ting å lage rapportene, men for at ikke de skal ligge i en skuff og samle støv, men faktisk bli brukt, så jobber Naturpanelet også med dette med støtteverktøy for beslutningstakere. Altså det kan jo være så mange ting, sant? Dette med å få gode figurer, dette med modeller og scenarier, og så videre, men kunnskapen i rapportene må bli brukt og ikke være støvsamlere. Det veldig viktig. Og det en global kunnskapsdugnad. Det så dere jo i den videoen også. Det ingen tvil om det. Og Naturpanelet ble opprettet i 2012, men det var faktisk ikke før i 2014, altså knappe 8 år siden, at man egentlig satte i gang med denne produksjonen her. Og som dere ser på lysarket her, dette jo det som produsert så langt, både metoderapporter, veldig viktig det der med å jobbe med god metodikk, dette med temarapporter, regionale rapporter, og da den første hovedrapporten i 2019. Så Naturpanelets eksperter har produsert utrolig mye i løpet av disse årene. Og da senest den på verdier og verdsetting, og den på bærekraftig bruk, som vi skal høre mer om i dag. Men jeg har også lyst til å gjenta det som ble sagt i videoen, for det en ting som veldig spennende, det at Naturpanelet nå går enda mer inn i det jeg kaller kjernen i problemet. Man har en rapport som pågår nå om gjennomgripende samfunnsendringer, transformative change, hvor man også ser på det der med hva samfunnsårsakene som ligger bak endringer i naturmangfold. De har en om dette som jeg gjerne bare kaller bærekraftsmålutredningen, for det at man ser rett og slett på koblinger mellom naturmangfold og viktige tjenester som mat, vann, helse, men også opp mot klima og energi. Altså hvorfor biomangfold viktig, og hvordan kan sektorene jobbe for denne bærekraftige utviklingen. Og så kommer det en som starter opp nå, man holder på å få timer på plass på det med næringsliv og naturmangfold, en metoderapport. Så veldig mye spennende arbeid fremover nå. Men dagens æresgjest, som jeg har lyst til å kalle det, jo da denne utredningen på bærekraftig bruk av naturmangfold, Sustainable Use of Wild Species. Og det jo litt som det står på lysarket. Det var nok først og fremst, det var mange land som støttet den, men det var da først og fremst konvensjonen som handler om dette med handel med truete arter, altså CITES. Det feil? Oi, ups. Der var det riktig, fint. Det var bra, dere må tipse om sånt. Ja, denne konvensjonen, altså CITES om handel med truete arter, det var de som i første rekke kom og bestilte denne rapporten. For den CITES-konvensjonen som den heter, altså der jo, altså formålet med den konvensjonen å ikke hindre internasjonal handel, men faktisk å sikre at internasjonal handel med ville arter ikke truer overlevelsen til en art. Og da jo kunnskap fra denne rapporten naturlig nok veldig viktig. Men også da konvensjonen for biologisk mangfold, som møtes nå i desember for å få nye globale mål om naturmangfold, har dette med bærekraftig bruk inne som en av sine 3 pilarer. Så i tillegg til å gi kunnskap til land, så gir da denne rapporten kunnskap til flere av de store miljøavtalene, som også Norge er en del av. Må jeg bare sjekke her. Yes. Formidling og bruk av rapporten. Bare helt avslutningsvis vil jeg bare si det med at dette som dere er med på i dag, og dette faktaarket som ligger foran dere på pulten, det er jo en del av det Miljødirektoratet gjør når disse rapportene kommer. Altså vi har i oppdrag å formidle rapportene, hjelpe til å spre det, og det gjør vi da både gjennom møter og skriftlig materiale og så videre. Men det er jo veldig viktig at den finner veien inn på ulike vis. Så dette her for eksempel med altså de kunnskapshull, knowledge gaps, som er identifisert i rapporten, er det jo viktig at blant annet dere er med og fyller etter hvert, og det er helt klart en viktig rolle for våre kunnskapsinstitusjoner. Og også dette at den finner veien inn i beslutningstaking og til forvaltningen. Og det vil jeg også si at det faktaarket som ligger foran dere, det er det jo blant annet studenter ved NTNU som har hjulpet oss med å lage, så go students, det er utrolig viktig at dere kommer inn i arbeidet med sånne ting som Naturpanelet. Og med dette så vil jeg bare si tusen takk for meg, og det er bare å ta kontakt med nasjonalt kontaktpunkt ved Miljødirektoratet hvis dere har ønsket mer informasjon på et senere tidspunkt. Tusen takk.
Tusen takk til Nina Vik.
Wild species are important to everyone, not just other people in other places. Many of us don't realize that the use of wild species plays a vital role in almost every person's life. Food, cosmetics, shelter, clothing, medicine, and inspiration are just some of the ways that we all benefit from the use of wild species. But how certain are we that these benefits will continue? On 8 July 2022, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services plans to launch a major new scientific report on the sustainable use of wild species. Prepared over 4 years by 85 leading experts from every region of the world and drawing on more than 6,000 sources, the report will help decision makers at every level understand the importance of the use of wild species, the causes of the unsustainable use, and the principles and conditions for effective policies and decisions that can help drive sustainable use. IPBES, Science and Policy for People and Nature.
Dette da som en introduksjon til dagens hovedtalere. Det slik at Naturpanelet, som vi har hørt, de har allerede laget en masse rapporter. Det involvert tusenvis av forskere. For denne rapporten, bærekraftig bruk av ville arter, så det mer enn 85 forfattere som har deltatt. Og vi har med oss noen av de i dag. Og jeg presenterer dere alle 3 på rams, fordi vi har en med på skjerm, 2 her i dag. Og så får dere heller supplere litt når dere går på scenen. Vi har Maria Embry fra Norsk institutt for naturforskning, som geograf og ekspert innenfor urfolk og lokalkunnskap og statsvitenskap. Og hun var også en av de ledende for selve utredningen. Med oss her i salen så har vi Elisabeth Barden, som fra NTNU, som har særlig fordypet seg i mennesker- og miljøutfordringer knyttet til bevaring og ressursforvaltning. Og Elisabeth var koordinerende hovedforfatter for hele utredningen. Vi har også med oss Rita Kigonya, stipendiat ved Geografisk institutt her ved NTNU, som også var en av hovedforfatterne for denne rapporten. Disse forfatterne vil da dele med oss hovedfunnene, hva som kom frem etter mange lange arbeidsøkter for å få denne utredningen ferdig. Og først ut da Maria Embry fra NINA, som vi har med oss på skjerm.
Hi, my name is Marla Emery, and I had the honor to co-chair the IPBES assessment of sustainable use of wild species. Among the other hats I've worn, for 31 years I was a research scientist with the US Forest Service, and I now serve as scientific advisor to NINA's Terrestrial Ecology Department. I want to extend my thanks to Nina Vik, her team, and the students for putting together this important opportunity to consider the sustainable use assessment and its relevance for policy in Norway. I regret that I cannot be with you in real time, but I'm delighted to greet you virtually and set the stage for my colleague, Elizabeth Barron. Elizabeth played a very important role in the assessment. She led the chapter on status and trends and uses of wild species, and I know you and she will have a vigorous and productive discussion. The first thing to know about uses of wild species is that they are widespread and important. This is true in developed nations as well as developing countries. The scope of that importance is evident in a few key facts. For example, at least 50,000 wild species meet the needs of billions of people worldwide, and more than 10,000 of those species are harvested for human food. 1 in 5 people, in fact, rely on wild species for income or food. And 2.4 billion people, that is 1 in 3, depend on fuel for cooking. But what do we mean when we speak of sustainable uses of wild species? In 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity defined sustainable use as the use of components of biological diversity in a way and at a rate that does not lead to the long-term decline of biological diversity, thereby maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of present and future generations. Following 4 years of work by more than 80 scientists from over 35 countries, 3 dialogue workshops with Indigenous and local people, and review of some 6,200 scientific references, the Sustainable Use Assessment expands that definition by adding that sustainable use is also an outcome of social ecological systems that aim to maintain biodiversity and ecosystem functions in the long term while contributing to human well-being. It is a dynamic process as wild species, the ecosystems that support them, and the social systems within which uses occur change over time and space. A second foundational definition for understanding what we are talking about here is that of what constitutes wild. One has only to consider reindeer, for example, to see that wild is often not a simple, straightforward proposition. There's been a great deal of scholarship on wildness as it relates to both plants and animals. Drawing on that scholarship, as well as empirical data, it can be helpful to understand wild species as referring to populations of any species that have not been domesticated through multi-generational selection for particular traits, and which can survive independently of human intervention that may occur in any environment. This does not necessarily imply a complete absence of human management, and recognizes various intermediate states between wild and domesticated. With those definitions in hand, let's look at the intellectual framework we use to examine the characteristics of sustainable use of wild species. Because sustainable use of wild species quite literally, as well as figuratively, covers a lot of territory. It encompasses plants, animals, and fungi in marine, terrestrial, and aquatic environments. It includes a multiplicity of practices for obtaining or interacting with those species and places, and myriad tangible and less tangible ways of using them. Each one of these factors influences outcomes. In other words, once again, uses of wild species are social ecological systems. And if we are to understand and enhance uses to assure their sustainability, it is essential that we address both the social and ecological components of any wild species use. Happily, there are examples of uses of wild species that have been sustainable for millennia. One that I know well is the case of wild rice, an aquatic plant that grows in the Great Lakes region of North America and has been harvested by the Ojibwe and Menominee peoples of that region for all of that time. Unfortunately, the sustainability of wild rice harvesting is now under threat because of factors such as runoff from mining, land use change, and climate change. There are also examples of uses of wild species that have become unsustainable and then return to sustainability. An example of a local and regional use of the pirarucu fish that you see here, which became unsustainable when a larger market developed for it, and only was returned to sustainability when local communities got together and developed management strategies and enforced those. Similarly, the large-scale markets for Atlantic bluefin tuna that developed along with the popularity of sushi in the 1980s led to a collapse in that population of bluefin tuna. But decades of work by scholars and governments has led to some outstanding management strategies that have restored the sustainability of the Atlantic bluefin tuna population. The takeaway here is we know how to do this, but all too often we don't. Now, Elizabeth will talk to you in greater detail about the characteristics of sustainable uses of wild species, in particular, the characteristics of governance that support sustainable uses of wild species. In preparation for this seminar, I've enjoyed contemplating what specifically the findings of the Sustainable Use Assessment might mean in Norway. So, in the interest of jump-starting our collective thinking, and I hope a larger and long-term discussion, I would like to suggest two broad domains in which sustainable use of wild species come into play in important ways in Norway: the Norwegian economy and Norwegian identity. Let's start with just one aspect of the economy. In 2020, the tourism industry contributed approximately 190 billion kroner to the Norwegian economy. Both extractive and non-extractive uses of wild species are important aspects of the tourism sector. A quick Google search for wild species-related tours in 2023 reveals the economic values that you see here on this slide, without calculating the knock-on returns that ripple throughout the economies of communities that host them. I think I'm beginning to understand some of the deep ways that Norwegian identity is connected to nature. Norwegians enact and reinforce this connection through at least one key law and many types of uses of wild species. The law I'm referring to here is sometimes translated as everyman's law, or the right to roam, which affords Norwegians the right to pick berries and mushrooms almost anywhere in the country. That is a law that is the envy of many a gatherer in the United States. It's noteworthy that Norway has the fourth highest per capita participation in hunting in the world, with some 140,000 citizens hunting big and/or small game each year. And, of course, uses of wild species, such as the drum you see here, are fundamental to Sami culture. How then does Norwegian policy intersect with the goal of sustainable use of wild species? Policy intersects in obvious ways through laws, rules, and regulations that pertain directly to fishing, gathering, hunting, logging, and wildlife watching. Policies in other essential sectors also intersect with the goal of sustainable use of wild species in perhaps somewhat less obvious, but no less important ways through their effects on landscapes, seascapes, and the species in them. These sectors include, but certainly are not limited to, energy, forestry, and climate change. As I said earlier, we know how to do this, but all too often we don't. I hope that this seminar and the Sustainable Use Assessment will be just early steps in thinking about sustainable uses of wild species in Norway. We might ask ourselves, where are the existing uses that are sustainable, and what would support them going into the future? Where are the existing unsustainable uses of wild species, and what opportunities are there for making them more sustainable? It's been a pleasure to be with you, even if it had to be virtual. I turn you over now to Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Maria Emery. I will then invite Elizabeth Barron and Rita Kanja.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here. My name is Elizabeth Barron, and I'm an associate professor at the here at NTNU in the Department of Geography. As we heard earlier, I was a coordinating lead author on the Sustainable Use Assessment in charge of Chapter 3, and I've invited Rita to join me, who was also with me then.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm Rita Chigonya, and I am a PhD candidate at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in the Geography Department. Well, I will start the presentation, and my colleague Elizabeth will complete it. Why did we have the Sustainable Use Assessment in the first place? The Sustainable Use Assessment was carried out for a number of objectives, among which is to provide best available evidence, analysis, and options for the decision makers in the use of wild species. To also consider approaches that enhance the sustainable use of wild species. It also contributes to the work on the Convention of Biological Diversity. For example, next week, we shall have a team of the experts from IPBES in the Sustainable Use Assessment team joining the COP15 of the CBD to share the experiences and the evidences that were obtained from this report to further enhance the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The assessment also contributes to the CITES's goal of ensuring international trade in wild species. About 2 weeks back, Elizabeth and other colleagues who were also in the team of the IPBES team on the Sustainable Use Assessment joined COP19 in Panama, where they did share some of these findings to also enhance the discussions in the CITES. The report also aims at supporting implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and also recognize the inseparable unity of nature and humanity. When did we start this assessment? This assessment started in 2018. It was supposed to take 3 years, but unfortunately due to COVID, there were challenges and it was extended by 1 full year. And we successfully completed the assessment, and in 2022 July, earlier this year, we had it being approved by the member states. We do want to note something at the beginning of this presentation, and we want to address a common response to the idea of unsustainable use and the suggestion to just stop using wild species. This report, SOAR, makes it very clear that it is not possible and it is not advisable to just stop communities from using wild species. And in fact, it does not produce any desirable ecological results, and it is also a justice issue. Now we are going to address some findings that were obtained in this report. In our chapter 3, we did look at the status and trends in the use of wild species. And this particular diagram right here is from, it's also within the summary of policymakers, and it does synthesize all the practices right here, and 2 to 3 use categories from these particular practices. And then it does provide a summary of information on how these are being used, the levels of use for over 20 years, and the levels of sustainable use in the same period of time. So we do have some color codings within the arrows that do evidence the level of confidence that experts had with the data they used. And the arrows show whether it increased, the use increased, or the use reduced if the arrows point downwards. And the horizontal arrows simply show stability. And we do have the cross arrow, which shows high variability. For example, if we look at the practice of gathering, and specifically for food and feed, the summary of policymakers shows an increase in over 20 years of gathering for food and feed. And the sustainable use of this practice is assessed as stable. The purple color here shows the evidence is well established, but incomplete in some areas. And this case is likely due to this being a comparatively poorly documented practice in relation to the known extent of the practice. So we do have other color codes, like we have green showing well established, we have orange showing that it is unresolved, and we have inconclusive results where we did not have enough data to actually prove that this is the use. And why it is unresolved, it's because there are a variety of opinions and suggestions from various authors, and we did not have a unified decision about the uses of these practices. We had some few examples that we clearly stipulated within this report, within the assessment, and among them, we can say that along with Chile and China, Norway leads in global exploitation of wild seaweed stocks. Some recent research also evidences that at least 273 wild edible plants from 67 botanical families are gathered in Norway. Fruits and berries, leaves and flowers are among the most common parts that were being collected by the respondents of this research. Nature-based tourism is greatly increasing in Norway and is highly valued as an education tool and also contributes to the sustainable use. The use of national parks and green spaces for tranquility really increased drastically during the COVID-19 pandemic. And for example, it was ascertained that in Oslo, the use of nature spaces increased by over 290% in that same period. We do have a lot of recreational hunting. For example, hunting of the moose here in Norway, which is for the purposes of obtaining wild meat, socializing, exercising, and simply going out in nature. Over 30% of Norwegians are involved in recreational fishing. It is one of the countries that has got the highest number of individuals carrying out recreational fishing. Norway also continues to hunt whales commercially and also use it for aboriginal subsistence. So although Norway and, for example, Iceland are members of the International Whaling Commission, they do still hunt the whale, which is supposedly not supposed to, and the minke and the fin whales among the most common species that are being hunted here. In Chapter 4, we also looked at some of the drivers. So the sustainability of use of wild species is influenced negatively or positively by multiple drivers. These can be classified, these can be classified as either environmental and, for example, pollution or climate change. We do have global trade, which is among the economic drivers. And trade in wild species is actually really high and a great driver in the use of the different wild species. Illegal harvesting and trade of wild species is classified as the third largest within the illegal trade categories. Lack of attention to gender and equitable distribution of costs and benefits also contributes to the unsustainable use of these species. And we also have governance factors like policies, formal and informal. We have institutions, education platforms, and public awareness. All these can promote positive outcomes and mitigate negative impacts in the use of wild species. These drivers came out profoundly within the literature that the experts were using in the assessment. However, we also do have those that were under-recognized within the literature, but these were also stipulated within the assessments. We have, for example, upstream impacts that also profoundly affect the use of these species. For example, habitat loss and degradation or pollution in the upstreams. We also know that as consumer trends change, there can be unintended impacts on the various species. For example, a shift in premium pricing for wild salmon, despite ample availability of the farmed salmon, can also affect its consumption. Online trade and social media have provided new platforms for the consumption and trade of wild species. We also have some mediating factors that can lead to positive utilization or positive sustainable use of wild species. For example, education. We are having a number of outreach activities also increasing in schools. We are increasingly recognizing the value of indigenous and local knowledge systems, and also a number of participatory and collaborative processes with the various communities. Elizabeth can continue from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Rita. So one of the things that we looked at in the sustainable use assessment were the wide range of indicator sets that are currently used to determine and examine sustainable use. And one of the things that we found right away was there are actually a wide range of indicator sets that have many indicators for certain practices and certain species. But notably, these are mostly for commercial and large-scale fishing and logging. And the light green here shows that the most of those indicators are in regards to ecological dimensions. Interestingly, these are the practices with the smallest number of species which are used by people. And in comparison, there are relatively few indicators for small-scale fishing, which is very important practice for local communities and supports the livelihoods of over 90% of people engaged in capture fisheries globally. However, the most sort of striking aspect of this particular figure for us was that it clearly demonstrates the almost complete lack of indicators relative to the gathering of plants, animals, and fungi. So you can see here that over 25,000 species of plants, algae, and fungi are used, but has an incredibly small indicator set. And this both made issues for us when we were assessing the sustainability of use, but also wanted to sort of highlight for us that these taxa are generally under-researched and underrepresented in science policy interface. So we did a bit more to sort of highlight the plants, algae, and fungi, and especially in terms of the trade and the scope of the extent of their use, because trade in wild plants, algae, and fungi is actually a billion-dollar industry with supply chains that fuel economic development, both in developed countries and developing countries. This trade is actually increasing worldwide, especially in 3 areas. With food and aromatics, we see a growing demand, especially in developed countries, in relation to fine dining, interests in local foods, wild foods, and also as rural populations are migrating into urban spaces, they're still hoping to eat sort of some of their traditional wild foods, which are then extracted and sent to urban spaces. We see a growing demand for wild species in the health industry, as the products from those wild species are either used for holistic or traditional medicines, or then synthesized to complement chemical medicines. And then also with ornamental plants, especially with cacti and orchids, poaching continues to occur, and this has increased over the last 40 years, which has threatened the survival of some of these species, and most of them are now on CITES lists. So Chapter 5 of the assessment looks at scenarios, and this is another area where there are very few scenarios for the uses of wild species, and those that do exist are mostly for fishing and logging. So this really challenged the team in terms of future planning and predictions, which is the work of the scenarios in the assessment. However, of course, it did suggest, not surprisingly, that climate change poses a significant challenge to sustainable use across all of the practices, pretty much in all the data that we examined. Other future challenges are, interestingly, increasing demand and technological advances which have negative impacts. So we often think of technological advances as positive for environmental management and mitigation. However, with regards to sustainable use of wild species, it emerged that it was important to sometimes recognize the negative effects of technological change. And finally, addressing and meeting these challenges will require transformative changes, which, as you heard previously, will be the work of the Transformative Changes Assessment. And so we are now working with that team in order to inform them from the sort of key aspects from our report. So another element that we really highlighted in the Sustainable Use of Wild Species Assessment was the importance of multiple knowledge systems, especially indigenous and local knowledge. And this comes directly from the IPBES conceptual model and was especially important in the Sustainable Use of Wild Species Assessment. And so our entire process was guided by the Indigenous and Local Task Force of IPBES, and we made I would say significant efforts to recognize multiple sources and formats of knowledge and to address the biases in the availability of documented resources and of knowledge and interpreting the strength of the evidence. Because of the way that we generally perceive what evidence is in the scientific process, it can sometimes be bit in tension with the sort of IPBES conceptual framework. This is something that we really tackled through the sustainable use assessment process. Some of the insights that came from this experience were that indigenous peoples and local communities are uniquely vulnerable to unsustainable use of wild species, and that strong systems of governance play a critical role in solutions such as monitoring and adaptive management. And I'll talk about that a bit more in just a second. So when we think about the sort of policy outcomes and the durable outcomes from the sustainable use assessment, what are some of the messages that we can take moving forward to help inform our activities, both scientific and policy decision-making activities? The first is the important role of the sustainable use of wild species in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So what you see on the slide here are the 17 SDGs listed, and the gray section shows areas where the sustainable use of wild species are already taken into account in the ability to achieve those SDGs. Importantly, in green is the additional ways in which the sustainable use of wild species could lead to and contribute to the achievement of these sustainable development goals. And so you see here that there's significant potential for the sustainable use of wild species to contribute in achieving every single one of the sustainable development goals. As we were preparing for the CITES meeting and the upcoming CBD meeting, we started to think about this policy process a little bit differently from our perspective in terms of intended outcomes of identifying unsustainable use and how that can threaten survival. And that was a key message from the 2019 report. And then we acknowledged that we play this important role in doing these assessments, and then we pass these assessments on to CITES community and other sort of measures, other policy communities, which create different sort of implementation strategies, and then ideally those lead to sustainable use and reduced threat from trade in the case of CITES, which then has a positive feedback loop for positive outcomes and possible downlisting or even delisting of species which were previously threatened. However, in our assessment, we identified the fact that too often implementation results in not the necessarily outcome that we had hoped, in that ongoing unsustainable use continues and actually social inequities are expanded in a way, or they expand, which then has a negative feedback loop to illegal trade, implementation challenges, and then resulting in additional measures and revisions to often stricter requirements. And so one of the key aspects of the sustainable use assessment in the terms of governance was that we saw that actually in cases where social dimensions and innovations are made to address these sort of ongoing unsustainable use aspects, then there's a sort of a reversion into the intended outcome path, as you see on the slide, which really highlights the importance of social research and attention to the social dynamics in what Marla called the social ecological system. So in chapter 6, where we did a significant assessment of the existing sort of policy structures and frameworks regarding sustainable use, we identified 7 enabling conditions which result in more sustainable policies. So this is a figure directly from the SPM, which I would encourage you to look at in more detail there. But essentially you can see that enabling conditions are such as democratic and adaptive management, robust institutions, having policies and decisions that are tailored to the context in which they are enacted, policies that align with broader policies to avoid a sort of a scale mismatch, and then policies that are inclusive and participatory, recognize plural knowledge systems and values, and share benefits equitably. Of course, this is juxtaposed with constraining conditions, which are essentially the opposite of those enabling conditions, those that ignore history and rights, that overlook the social context, that create what's called scale mismatches, where there's something happening at the local level which is different than is happening at the national level, criminalizes the marginalized, creates power imbalances, and perhaps over-relies on laws and rules, and then again under-relies on understanding the social context. When we applied these conditions to the different practice areas, we see that in fishing, there is a wide range of legally binding policy options which are in place in regards to that practice. And so it's really helping to advance the sustainable use of wild species in that area, and we saw that in the data. It's much less the case with gathering and logging, and certainly with terrestrial animal harvesting and non-extractive uses. So finally, when we think about trying to strengthen durable outcomes, we identified the need for robust indicator sets that are both sensitive and specific to the species and practices in use. We identified that there are knowledge gaps for data and information about wild species and their uses, especially with regards to indigenous local knowledge. We noticed that for many species, the only reason that trade data exist is if they're already listed on CITES in the appendices. And so we found that there's actually a need for additional trade data for taxa that are not on CITES, and especially that is close to, attentive to the distinction between wild and farmed species. And we also identified a need to look a little bit more in depth at various certification and labeling schemes, because there is a very wide range of these schemes at this point in different marketplaces and with different types of products. And not only is it difficult for the policymakers sometimes to understand this range of certification and labeling schemes, but it in fact can be very challenging for the consumer. And like we did with the sort of status and trends, we also looked through the report with regards to policy outcomes for special issues here in Norway and identified 3 cases from the report. The first is the case of wolf management, which is a form of integrated species and habitat management, which has resulted in Norway, like in other places, in population recovery. But this has had perhaps an unintended effect of leading to conflict regarding the management strategies. And so this is a situation where trying to understand the sort of social and political context of the issue certainly is relevant here. Second, in Norway, the majority of forests are privately owned, and there's a wide variation in the freedom to decide the amount of timber that one will harvest off of one's property and how that timber will be harvested. So this can lead to high spatial variation in the forest ecosystems, which is something that we discuss in a bit more detail in the report with regards to extraction of wild species from those ecosystems. And then finally, there was a very nice example in a text box that you can read in one of the chapters regarding the use of long-term data sets, and with a focus on the how Norway handled the cod fisheries crash in 1989 exceptionally well in relation to other places where that fishery struggled in Canada and the United States. And it discusses the use of long-term data sets and learning from history and the experience of the in the late 1960s and early 1970s of the Norwegian herring fishery crash was in this case able to sort of help with the recovery, more rapid recovery of the cod fishery. And so with this example, what is stated in the report is that it's very important to remember the history and maintain long-term data sets in order to enhance and increase the effectiveness of management. And then finally, we just want to take a brief moment to acknowledge other contributors from Norway that participated mostly in the role of contributing authors. There's so many acronyms in IPBES. So as you see on the list here, all these folks were contributing authors, and Håkon was actually a fellow in chapter 1, and so they all should also be recognized. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elisabeth and Rita. We do have time for some questions. It's okay det helt greit å stille spørsmål på norsk. Det mulig å få svar på engelsk, men spørsmålet kan godt reises på norsk. Det noen som brenner inne med noe? Vi har en mikrofon som kan sendes rundt hvis så tilfellet. Da var det en der.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was a great talk. I was just wondering if these sustainable uses were considered in the framework of climate change as well, because harvesting and species are reacting to climate change. They're changing their distributions. Their populations are declining because of climate change. So I was just wondering if that was considered in this as well.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. It's certainly very relevant, and that is very much the topic of the IPBES and IPCC joint report in terms of the bigger picture. For our particular assessment, we do have a fair bit of text on knowledge gaps, and this is definitely one of them. Because as you said, the species are changing quite a lot in terms of their ranges, their behavior, and what that's going to look like under different sort of climate model predictions is something that is uncertain. So we, in chapter 3 at least, have a section on emerging issues for each of the practices, and that's usually where you'll find that information.
Thank you. And we have one there.
Thank you. I'm Trond at the NTNU. I was curious about one thing that you touched upon, both of you, briefly, and that is regarding fishing practices in Norway, because I think you mentioned the cod fishery and the herring fishery and management efforts in regard to that, and your colleague spoke about particular challenges or issues that were important when it came to use of wild animals in Norway. But wouldn't I be right that by far the most extensive use of wild animals in Norway, both economically but also in terms of volume and impact on life and biodiversity, would be fishing, not only in Norwegian waters but worldwide? Isn't that maybe the big thing?
Do you want to start?
Well, thank you for that notification, and you are very right that when we are looking at in chapter 3, the fishing section actually, or the fishing practice was really, you would say, more dynamic, and because of the context specificness of, is it small scale, is it, which region is it, because different governments have different policies, and also there are some international conventions we're supposed to be following, like I hinted on the one of fishing of the whales, and I did comment that Norway does not either just objects the convention or simply just ignores it. So it is true that fishing turned out to be one of the practices that was more dynamic in terms of sustainability, but also very much context specific on where it is sustainable. But of course, in most cases, it turned out to be really unsustainable. But we do have positive cases. That's what we're trying to show, that when we rely on history, when there is political will, there are measures that can be implemented in particular areas and can have sustainability. But it's also, what scale are you looking at the fishing? In Norway, we do look at it in terms of more or less recreation. We have a lot of recreation. Of course, we also have a lot of economic that is governed also. But the policies that look at how we fish in Norway, how much you can fish and what equipment you use also contributes on the scale of how much you collect and what implication it has to the sustainability of the species.
Yeah, so I guess I would just add a few comments to that. One is that the report, what we did here was we pulled out a bit of the places where Norway is mentioned as a case study, but of course the overall report is a global scale. So it doesn't necessarily address the sort of complete picture in any one country. But importantly, the really nice thing about the fisheries data sets is that they're well documented. So as you saw in the indicator slide, we have there, especially for the global commercial fisheries, there's extensive indicator sets and a lot of data available as well. But I just would reiterate that in terms of the number of species, and this actually goes with the scale of the harvesting activity as well, it's actually gathering of wild plants, algae, and fungi, that in terms of the number of people, I don't know in Norway, but globally the number of people and the number of species that are affected is the largest practice category. Yeah, but in terms of the Norway specifics, I would certainly I think you're probably much more expert on that than we are. So we'd look to hear from you perhaps later. Thank you.
Thank you. Some tight program here, but we have time for one last question, if anybody wants. Up there.
My question was on the slide about why we shouldn't just completely stop using wild species. And I was wondering, is the main reason for that because we would lose a lot of jobs, or is the focus on something else?
Yeah, so if we look at the two main points on this slide about why not just stop using wild species, and the first comes from this idea that stopping using wild species doesn't always produce the desired ecological results, okay? And what we mean here is that there are actually many cases where a species comes under a sort of a fortress conservation model, and there's a complete ban on its use, and it creates actually some problems in the population, either because the species has co-evolved with humans as they used the species over time, and that's certainly the case with a lot of plants and fungi to some extent, but is also because sometimes they can then lead to a population explosion, or which then sort of creates an unhealthy situation with the environment. But again, keeping in mind that this is a social ecological system that we're talking about, that wild species exist in, it's very important to understand what I said in the later part of the presentation about this sort of negative and positive feedback loops, that when you create a situation like a complete ban on a species which was previously used, which then becomes illegal to use, and you have negative effects on the social conditions of people who relied on that species for food, for income, for health reasons, it creates a series of negative effects which then actually have a detrimental effect on the species itself. And that's very clear in the data that we reviewed for the assessment. So it's inequitable, and it actually often results in this sort of negative social consequences feedback loop and unintended outcomes.
And maybe just to add on the inequitable, we do have statistics that show a great proportion of people entirely depending on this species for their survival. So ideally saying we should stop, you are depriving communities and depriving all the people in Norway of all their freedom of live, you would say. You wouldn't have that opportunity to do your recreational activities because we have put a ban on all that. So it becomes more or less an injustice to the communities who entirely depend on these resources for their survival.
Okay, thank you again so much, both of you. I hope you use the opportunity to talk with the authors during lunchtime, for example. But for now, thank you so much. Da vi rigget dette programmet, så var det ikke noe tvil om at vi skulle ha veldig fokus på studenter, og vi innledet straks et samarbeid med NTNU, Jervåsenteret og Nina. Og som jeg sa innledningsvis, altså det dere som litt yngre enn oss som litt eldre. Det dere som må rydde opp. Og dermed så synes jeg det var naturlig også å ha en egen bolk for dere. Og det har vi kalt Dagens studenter, fremtidens forskere og forvaltere. Og til å styre den bolken så skal jeg introdusere Gunnar Austrheim, som da professor på Naturhistorisk institutt på Vitenskapsmuseet. Og Vitenskapsmuseet som dere vet, det eldste vitenskapelige institusjonen i Norge fra 1760. 150 år eldre enn Universitetet i Oslo. Jeg bare liker å si det. Og så det slik da at Gunnar han spesielt interessert i bevaringsbiologi og økologi, hvordan menneskeskapte prosesser påvirker biologiske mangfold, økosystemer og økosystemtjenester. Med andre ord, veldig tett opp til hva Naturpanelet jobber med. Vær så god, Gunnar.
Ja. Tusen takk, Jan Petter. Jeg må også si at det veldig bra å ha Naturpanelet her til stede på universitetet på NTNU. Vi skal, som Jan Petter sa, ha noen innspill fra studentene, og vi skal også ha innspill fra folk som jobber med undervisning og program og kurs, den delen. Men før jeg introduserer de, så vil jeg bare minne om at det mulig å skrive inn spørsmål på learnlab.net. Gå inn der, bruk koden 224187, så kan man skrive spørsmål og kommentarer. Og så håper vi å få tid til et par av de helt på slutten før lunsj. And the questions could be both in Norwegian and English. So Elisabeth, she understands Norwegian as well. Prefer to answer in English, but could be questions in Norwegian. Okay, then it's time to introduce the students. So we have 4 students from Natural Resources Management. So the international master program. So it's Ingvild, it's Tahmid, it's Per, and it's Kirsten. And they will present, they also actually did the translation, producing the fact sheet. So they will present their perspectives on the assessment. Please.
Yeah, hello. So we are students at Natural Resource Management, both geography and biology. Yeah, we made the fact sheets, so we want to share with you some of our thoughts about the IPBES report as we read it for, to make this.
So one of the main challenges we met was because we were supposed to confine the whole report into 4 pages. So how do we keep this accurate as well as shorten it down a huge amount? As well as translating it from English to Norwegian, we also had to keep in mind that we have to change another language, so then we have to, how do we keep this precise?
Now, just in case you haven't read it already, I want to give you our interpretation of the most important elements of this report. So I think the regulation aspect is very important when it comes to sustainable use, but how you do the regulation is almost as important. So you need to be to base all your policies on knowledge and monitoring, but it also has to be context specific and include local and indigenous knowledge to be able to actually be useful where it is. It also needs to be fair to, especially to the people who are affected by your regulations, and it needs robust institutions to be able to enforce these rules that you're putting in place, and it also needs to align at international, national levels, so both at large and small scale. Otherwise, you will not have the desired results.
So for us as students, of course, our main concern is, right now we're trying to build our knowledge. That's part of the motto of NTNU, right, is building knowledge for a better world. But the report really focuses on action and how you can support policies through robust action at all different scales. So for us as students, we're a part of that, developing that action for the future. So we were thinking about this report in the context of our student life here at NTNU and how NTNU can be a part of this action. So our interpretation was really focusing on building our knowledge through context awareness for both the local Norwegian students as well as us international students, and really being adaptable to these different environments and the knowledge that we bring. We also wanted to emphasize the interdisciplinary approaches that are required to develop this action. We feel that this needs to be happening early on in student studies, in the bachelor's level especially. For me as a biologist, I had quite a lot of natural resource planning, but not many people have, depending on their background, and we need to start that early in order to develop this holistic approach. And we really think practical experience needs to be a part of these learning outcomes, knowing how to apply this knowledge that we are building early on and see those avenues for action.
Well, to expand off of what Kirsten already said, well, NTNU is a knowledge hub, but it isn't the only knowledge hub. There are also many other external institutions all over Trondheim and all over the country. And we wanted to focus on how we can use these external institutions to better understand our knowledge and to identify issues. Well, the best thing about studying in a different country is that we meet a lot of different perspectives. And that's the first thing we kind of want to focus on, is to identify problems that already exist in other places in the world, but that may have very unique solutions. So we could have a discussion on that to understand how different places deal with the same problems. And the other thing that we notice, especially when working with, let's say, having internships or other sort of like partnerships with different institutions, is that when we focus on a particular problem, a lot of the raw data that we need to actually look into these problems are not really there. So we first need to collect the data, and then we need to solve the problem. This takes a lot of time. So what we suggest is that the university should work with other institutions to build up this data from early on through the bachelor's level or through the master's level. So data such as people's perception of nature, or let's say the amount of wildlife there are, the count of the wildlife there are, and then what kind of environment they're used to. And we need data from very specific local context. So for example, different communas, different places, as niche as we can get. And once we have these data built up over time, we can use those data through, let's say, master's thesis or bachelor's thesis to properly evaluate them and see how we can conserve them. That way, it speeds up the whole process and it engages the students in a way that's very relevant to the modern day. And that's basically our understanding of the whole report, what we take away from it, and our suggestion as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have time for some questions around your comments. And I see, Elisabeth, you are taking notes here. But I think one question for me, I mean, Elisabeth, you have been in Norway for 2 years around, and you come from the American system. And it's a lot of focus on the need of having an interdisciplinary research community. And NARM is a collaboration between social sciences and natural sciences. So how do you see that? How is that working at NTNU?
That's a big question, Gunnar. I'm not sure that I'm qualified to speak for all of NTNU, but I can say that my experience in the NARM program certainly is one where there's a great interest in trying to understand this interdisciplinary lens and how we can interpret it and use it. And so not to assume that there's one way to do interdisciplinarity or that we will achieve interdisciplinarity, the best version of it, and then that's what we'll just keep doing. So one of the things that I really liked in your presentation now and your sort of comments was this idea about interdisciplinarity and how do we do it and when do we start? Because I think that for many of the sort of older generation, shall we say, we have maybe had training in a single field in a very deep and sort of intentional way. And so while we are big proponents of interdisciplinarity, we may not understand necessarily the best way to do education, which actually prepares you both in the depth which is required to really understand the issues, but also in the breadth that interdisciplinarity requires. But what I think is very exciting is the focus at NTNU on sustainability and the way that that is evolving over time, because that is certainly something that I have experienced from other universities at how that was looked at across faculties, across different disciplines, not as an end point or as a solution, which, if only we can identify these conditions for sustainability, we'll get it. It's not some kind of climax state of a forest or something, right? It's this process which has lots of disturbances and lots of unexpected sort of events. And we need to understand, and especially for you as students, you need to be able to know how to interpret those events and those disturbances when they occur. And so I think that the different opportunities that you said here about different kinds of theses, different kinds of internships is really important. And really learning how to read different kinds of texts and critically engage with those texts. Because at university, you transition from a learning style where you are rapidly absorbing a lot of information and trying to just kind of get up to speed, to a learning style where you are expected to be a critical thinker and really have sort of comments and opinions and perspectives on the things that you're reading, not just absorb it passively. So that is, I think, a really valuable skill that the university space encourages for students. And then I think finally we just want to take seriously with regards to the sort of science policy interface, that's something that we also need to teach our students. Because I can say for myself actually that as a mid-career professional, once I got involved in IPBES, I understood that science policy interface in a completely new way. So for us as scientific staff at the university, as much as we can engage with these kinds of extra outside university organizations, we can then bring those experiences to the classroom and to our students, which I think is going to be exactly sort of what you guys are talking about with the extension of your learning. That was a bit long, but hopefully.
Many thanks, Elisabeth. I think we need to move on. And just a reminder, the code here is also written on the blackboard, so pose questions, please. Thank you. Og da fortsetter vi med undervisningssiden. Så Tor Harald Ringsby ved NTNU, han programleder for masterprogrammet Natural Resources Management, og det jo et program som akkurat fokuserer på denne her vitenskap for politikkendring. Så Tor Harald, vær så god.
Hjertelig takk.
Nå? Ja, der vi. Ja. Hjertelig takk for en grundig og viktig rapport fra IPBES. Jeg skal gi noen betraktninger rundt spørsmålet om hvordan universitetene kan utruste studentene med kunnskap og ferdigheter om bærekraftig forvaltning av ville arter, og for å bidra til de gjennomgripende samfunnsendringene som vi står overfor. Som sagt så jeg leder for et 2-årig masterprogram som heter Natural Resource Management, og vi har jo hilst på våre flotte studenter her. Vi forkorter det ofte til NARM her ved NTNU. Våre studenter morgendagens ledere, og gjennom sin karriere vil de arbeide i førstelinja med å realisere de gjennomgripende samfunnsendringene som vi står overfor. Det derfor helt avgjørende at vi utruster studentene med kunnskap, ferdigheter, holdninger og verdier til denne oppgaven. Vi tenker at en grunnleggende kompetanse for å forstå interaksjon mellom natur og samfunn å ha tverrfaglig innsikt. Derfor har vi i en årrekke basert programmet vårt på et samarbeid mellom Institutt for geografi og Institutt for biologi. Biologene bidrar med kunnskap om økosystemenes bærekraft og sårbarhet, noe som hele vårt samfunn og velferd hviler på. Og geografene bidrar med samfunnsinnsikt om interaksjon mellom samfunn og natur. Vi har derfor 2 spesialiseringer, en for biologer og en for geografer. Og vårt masterprogram tar opp en rekke sentrale tema som også sentrale i rapporten vi har fått presentert i dag. Forvaltning av økosystemtjenester, areal- og samfunnsplanlegging, rettighetshaveres interesser og motstridende interesser, sosioøkonomiske forhold, bærekraftsmål, for å nevne noen. I masteroppgaven så fokuserer studentene på tematikk omkring bærekraftig forvaltning av natur og samfunn. Og gjennom utdanningen vi veldig opptatt av å være i dialog med sektorene og samfunnsaktørene. Det gjør vi i form av gjesteforelesninger, ekskursjoner, prosjektarbeid og praksis, samt masterprosjekt ofte i samarbeid med institusjonene. Ja. Aha. Skal vi se. I denne rapporten fokus rettet mot hvordan vi kan oppnå en mer bærekraftig bruk av ville arter. Rapporten viser status og trender og tydeliggjør veiene fremover, som vi har hørt. Dette helt sentrale tema også for våre studenter, som skal bringe denne kunnskapen videre ut i samfunnet, slik at grunnleggende naturhensyn vektlegges. IPBES-rapporten understreker viktigheten av at alle rettighetshavere må involveres i beslutningsprosesser for å oppnå målet om mer bærekraftig bruk av de ville artene. Og den tette dialogen med samfunnsaktørene også helt sentralt og nødvendig for å tilby god bærekraftsutdanning. Gjennom praksis, ekskursjoner og prosjektoppgaver så skaper vi i vårt masterprogram møtepunkter Og møtepunkter mellom arbeidsliv og akademia, der vi utveksler kunnskap og erfaringer. Og vi lærer av hverandre. Så videre, hva bør universitetene prioritere i sine utdanningsprogram for å styrke bærekraftkompetansen? Her er det gjort et veldig godt arbeid i rapporten om bærekraft i høyere utdanning, som er laget av SDG Norway og UNESCO, og der vektlegges det 3 punkter. Høyere utdanning må bevege seg mot tverrfaglige måter å produsere og sirkulere kunnskap på. Unnskyld. Akkurat, ja, det er ikke helt... Det stemmer ikke overens. Ja, det var det første punktet. Nummer 2. Universitetene må bli mer åpne institusjoner som fremmer kunnskapssøkende dialog, og som innlemmer ulike typer kunnskap. Unnskyld. Nei, nå trykker jeg feil. Ja, og det 3. punktet. Universitetene må få en sterkere tilstedeværelse i samfunnet, gjennom proaktivt engasjement og samarbeid med andre samfunnsaktører. Ja. Til slutt så vil jeg gjerne stille 2 spørsmål. Først et til IPBES, og deretter et til Miljødirektoratet. Så til IPBES. Gitt deres erfaring med den akademiske sektoren, hvordan kan studieprogram fra ulike disipliner bidra med relevant kunnskap for en mer bærekraftig bruk av ville arter? Og så tar jeg spørsmålet til Miljødirektoratet samtidig. Hvordan kan universitetet bidra som en ressurs for å styrke bærekraftig forvaltning av ville arter? Finnes det temaer eller sektorer som er mer aktuelle for et tettere samspill mellom forvaltning og studenter? Takk for oppmerksomheten.
Ok, vi er litt over tiden, men kunne vi fått noen korte svar fra Elisabeth og kanskje Nina?
Dessverre, Gunnar, det får du ikke akkurat nå. Du skal få svar siden. Men vi er nødt til å gå til lunsj.
Okay.
Så da lar vi spørsmålene henge. Og så er det seriøst lunsj ute i Vrimelarealet, og der er det også en del stands og en del brosjyrer og postere. Og så må dere være tilbake her 10:10. Dette streames, dermed så må vi være tilbake her 10:10. Da får dere ta med dere mat og drikke inn her.
Og spesielt kikk på posterene til BI 1003-studentene. De står ute på Vrimelarealet.